It's Monday here on the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. I'm your host, Chris Carter. We've got Ray Fittipaldo joining us. We're going to talk about the Steelers' first big roster move of the offseason, which is making space in their salary cap to make future moves. What other moves like that could be coming? We'll talk about the new linebackers coach, as well as looking back on how the defensive line was constructed this year and what needs to be changing for that next year, all here in the North Shore Drive podcast. Let's get into it. You are now listening to the North Shore Drive podcast, a show on all things Pittsburgh sports from the writers of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, hosted by Christopher Carter. Hello and welcome to the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. I'm your host, Chris Carter, joined today by Ray Fittipaldo, one of our great Steelers beat writers. And as always, you can find this show on your favorite podcasting apps and on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoyed. Subscribe to this channel to get all of those Monday, Wednesday, Friday episodes, as well as the daily content that comes out from all of our sports writers here at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. As always, this show is brought to you by Edgar Snyder Associates. Whether you're injured in an accident or hurt on the job, Edgar Snyder Associates has helped injury victims for over 40 years recover more than $2 billion on their behalf. If you or a loved one have been seriously injured in an accident, call 1-800-94-EDGAR or visit www.edgarsnyder.com for a free consultation. Remember, there's never a fee unless they get money for you. Ray, we saw the first kind of domino fall in what the Steelers offseason plan is for their roster. They cut Preston Smith, the linebacker, the outside linebacker they traded for from the Dallas Cowboys in the middle of the season. Preston Smith, made a couple plays here and there, but it was always a plan for him to just be a 1 year, half-year rental even, with his salary cap hit being $13 million this year. And that's exactly what happened. They let him go. That boosts their salary cap to just over $53 million. Ray, you and I said that was going to be a necessary move this offseason. But what are the other moves that you're looking to follow it up with to kind of free up more cap space that the Steelers could get this season?
Yeah, I mean, that number, $53 million, I could easily see that going over $70 million, Chris, just with a few other simple moves on some aging guys who aren't producing. You look, number one, Larry Ogunjobi, if you make that move, that'll save you $8 million in cap space right there. You're over $60 million. There's a few other moves you can make too. I think Cordarrelle Patterson, I think you could free up a couple million there. And then the other big one would be inside linebacker Cole Holcomb. Now, Holcomb is maybe a little bit of a special circumstance. I think you could save yourself around $6 million there. I think you can do that in a way, though, where you cut him and you bring him back at an adjusted salary. So you might not recoup the entire $6 million there, but I do think, that's another move that could be had as well. So people are going to be talking about free agency here in another couple of weeks, and the Steelers are going to have plenty of money to address the many needs on their roster.
Certainly. And Cole Holcomb is a unique situation because he wasn't playing poorly 2 years ago when he was first signed and playing before he suffered a season-ending injury that took him out all that season and then all of this season. But that's just the thing. You haven't seen him in a year and a half. So I'd understand if the Steelers were like, hey, we'll figure out a new direction, or, if he wants to come back on a lesser deal. But $6 billion would save that there. But you're right. The Steelers could make their way to having over $70 million in cap space. And that's before doing any of the, the contract adjustments that they do to, push some money down the line and free up some more cash for this year. As it stands right now, Ray, they are right now they have the 8th most cap space in the NFL at this stage. Now, every other team also can make moves like this, and that could jumble things up. But if they were to get to 80, if they were to get over 70, they would have about the 5th most cap space in the NFL as it stands right now. That means they could be major players in the free agent market. They could also, make sure that they sign that one of the quarterbacks that they want to keep. I think that this is a unique position that Omar Khan has because of the situation the roster's in right now with, different positions in flux. And there is an opportunity here to continue to build the Steelers with some veterans. Like they brought in Patrick Queen last year to help stabilize the linebackers as they were missing Cole Holcomb. They were able to do what they needed to do in free agency, with other positions last year. So this is an opportunity for, hey, you've missed on some corners, you've missed on some receivers. Now's your chance to kind of replenish either those positions or other positions as well, with free agent veterans that could be out there.
Yeah, what they're going to have to do, Chris, is really pick their spots in free agency, because the quarterback position is going to take up probably anywhere, I'm guessing, between 12 and 25 million and how you structure it. I don't think Russell Wilson is in any position to command over 25 million now. So I look at that as the max for a 1 year. And then if you choose Justin Fields, you're probably talking 12 to 15 million. So that is going to eat up, a nice portion there. But you are going to have leftover money to address some needs. And I think you're going to have to look at the draft. Okay, where is the draft strong? Where can I, improve my roster through the draft? And then where is it weak, and where might I want to allocate my resources in free agency? Those are discussions they're having right now. So I think that's the big thing. Typically corner is a position that they would address in free agency or trades. They've done that a lot in recent years, thinking back, Dante Jackson, Akello Witherspoon.
Mm-hmm.
That seems to be a position where they're more likely to address in a trade or free agency rather than draft and develop. So we'll see what avenue they go now. But whether it's defensive line, receiver, corner, probably not safety. But those are probably the top 4 or 5 positions that we'll be discussing in another month or so.
I think corner makes a lot of sense, especially because Joey Porter Jr. is still that young player that you're developing for the cornerback position. You also have Corey Trice that you're hoping works out. But getting a veteran to work with those guys, as well as Beanie Bishop, that could be an answer to kind of bring an older head in the room who's been in the NFL, who's experienced in that department. And that's where, I look to a guy like Byron Murphy, who's in the free agent market right now as a cornerback, most recently with the Vikings. He had a really strong year. He's 27 years old. He'd probably be one of the more expensive cornerbacks on the market. But again, you could afford that right now. And he's a guy that plays both in the slot and outside and can play with top receivers. So if you were able to add a Byron Murphy, I think that would be a really good fit for what the Steelers need. And again, if you're addressing all these other positions right now in the draft, we'll talk about D tackle in a little bit here. Wide receivers a big need there. Other positions that you could look at this way. Corner wouldn't necessarily have to be your first or your second round pick. You can get a 3rd or 4th round guy who can be another developmental piece for whenever that veteran that you sign maybe ages out of his contract.
Yeah, and it would be nice if they could do that in stages, right? Maybe you get your corner in the early stages of free agency. Maybe you could also deal for a receiver, make a trade, at the start of the new league year rather than waiting until draft day. So you can kind of have your roster, not totally figured out, but you can put those pieces together in a way where you could really concentrate your efforts on a couple of positions in the draft. It's not always going to work out that way. GMs are smart. They're going to want to get the most bang for their buck,
right?
For their trade pieces. And really typically sometimes that is, the middle of March when the new league year starts, but sometimes it's, it's draft day or, sometime around the draft. So we'll have to see how that happens. But, the good thing for the Steelers, Chris, is that, receiver is a huge need for them. It's a good year for receivers. Defensive line is a huge need for them. Good year for defensive line in the draft. Running back may or may not be a huge need for them, depending on what they do with Najee Harris, but it's probably the deepest running backs class that we've seen in more than a decade. So that's the good news for the Steelers. I think Omar really has to be smart, though. You haven't had a strong history recently of developing defensive backs, so maybe that is the route you go. Maybe you do spend money in free agency, even if it's 15, 20 million a year on a guy like Byron Murphy. Maybe you make that commitment for once, pair him with Joey Porter, and see where that leads you, 2-3 years down the road.
I mean, heck, when they signed Steven Nelson and then found their way to get Joe Hayden, that was one of their best cornerback combos they've had in the past several years. So certainly makes a lot of sense there. We'll see what moves they make there. But we referenced defensive line. We want to take a look at this defensive line and how it was shaped this year, how it could be shaped differently next year. That next on the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Chris Carter, Ray Fittipaldo. But first, we'll remind you this show is brought to you by Edgar Snyder Associates. If you're injured in an accident, you're probably wondering what's next. Well, for over 40 years, Edgar Snyder Associates has helped injured victims answer that very question. Whether it's gathering evidence, collecting medical records, or dealing with the insurance companies, Edgar Snyder Associates has helped over 75,000 people handle the question, what's next? Call 1-800-94-EDGAR or visit www.edgarsnyder.com for a free consultation. Remember, there's never a fee unless they get money for you. We're back here in the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Chris Carter, Ray Fittipaldo. Ray, let's talk about the Steelers' defensive line. Now, this is the defensive line that has had some investment in it. Cam Heyward, is the longtime guy that this team has developed. He's become an all-pro in the NFL. He's a captain on the team, and he's signed for a few more years now with his extension. But behind him, you have an interesting assortment of players. You have Keeanu Benton, who just finished his second year with the team. We've talked about how he's, on the rise, but, maybe wondering where he fits best in the defensive line, maybe at a 3 technique rather than nose. But then after that, you have a lot of questions. You have DeMarvin Leal, who was injured yet again in the in his past season. He's suffered a few injuries. You have veterans like Montravius Adams, Dean Lowry, Isaiah Loudermilk, Logan Lee, who haven't really, stood out for the team. And then there's Larry Ogunjobi, who is signed for his current contract, makes him a $10 million salary cap hit. And we were talking about how they could create cap space. He's one of those guys. But Ray, if the Steelers are going to have a better defensive line next year than they did this year, what are the things they have to do to get there with the guys that they have and finding guys that they don't have?
Yeah, I think they have to find better players, and they have to find more players that they feel comfortable with in a bigger rotation. Now, if you look at the way the Eagles structure their defensive line, other than Jalen Carter, they pretty much have rundown football with guys like Jordan Davis, and then they'll have passing down football where they'll bring in a guy like Milton Williams and other guys. And we'll get to him in a second. He's going to be a free agent. They could certainly allocate some of their money there. He was a Andy Weidl draft pick. He was part of the 2021 Eagles draft class. That was the last one that Andy oversaw with Philadelphia before he came to Pittsburgh, I believe. So, how do you want to structure your defensive line? For the Steelers, whether it's just by circumstance or injuries, Cam Heyward, Keeanu Benton, Larry Ogunjobi really played the bulk of the snaps in that rotation. DeMarvin Leal, maybe they were going to count on him more this year. He gets injured. Isaiah Loudermilk is a guy that they're only comfortable playing him, 10 or 15 snaps a game. And that's the same with Montravius Adams, maybe a little bit more with Adams, but there's not this set rotation that you have with teams like the Eagles. If you look at the Eagles, they invested a first-round pick in Jordan Davis.
Yep.
Chris, he only plays half the snaps. He is basically a 2-down defender. And then they bring in Milton Williams, who also plays 50% of the snaps, but he's more of a pass rush specialist. Now, he's not terrible against the run, but that's not how the Eagles used him. So I think for the Steelers, you want to just accumulate as many good players as you can, and maybe figure out really what you want to do with your rotation. Because let's be honest, how smart is it to play a 36-year-old Cam Heyward for 75% of the snaps? No. Right. I mean, eventually he's going to slow down. Not that he slowed down last year. We all know that guy had a great year, but eventually you're going to want to get into a situation where you're grooming his replacement. And maybe that's more of a 50-50 distribution in snaps. And you could do that at other positions too. Figure out what you want to do with Benton. If Benton is your nose, fine. But then bring in somebody else who's going to be your pass rusher. If you think Benton can play 3 technique and give you more in the pass rush, then maybe draft Kenneth Grant or another big, space-hitting defensive tackle in the first or second round this year. So to me, they got to figure out what do they want to do. And I think no matter what decision they come to, you got to get a bigger rotation. You got to get better players. That's first and foremost in my mind.
No, I agree, because again, we could look at the Steelers starters and D line, but they haven't had that rotation that's had dynamics at those different levels. Whereas the Eagles, they were able to rotate guys. And it's funny, you bring up Milton Williams as the Eagles pass rushing specialist. How about I'll give you a name that played against Milton Williams as a run specialist, and that was the Chiefs' Tershawn Wharton, who I think was a big part of what the Chiefs were able to do to limit Saquon Barkley in that game. And granted, the Chiefs got demolished elsewhere, but when it came to the middle part of the field, Tershawn Wharton was whooping a lot of tail. That was against a really good Eagles offensive line. And both of these guys, Milton Williams Tershawn Wharton's 27, Williams is 26. Both are unrestricted free agents heading into this year. Now, I doubt you could sign both because probably they're both going to go for some decent money. But maybe you say, hey, you know what? That's the investment you need to make. If you draft a Kenneth Grant, sign these two guys, and you don't have to sign them for huge money, then you could have a rotation of guys where you have your run stuffers, you have your pass rushers, and you're keeping guys fresh. And then all of a sudden you're the unit tiring out the offensive line for most. Yeah. But I agree. That's more the line of what the Steelers need to have this year. It can't just be like your top three defensive linemen that you trust, and then behind them you have an assortment of guys that you're like, you just hope that they don't get beat. You need to have guys that are the tone changers, the tone setters, the game changers, because that's what if you're going to be a team that dominates the trenches, like you talk about Andy Weidl. That's why they went and got him, was to make him like the Eagles. This is one of those chances where we're talking about they're going to have all this salary cap space. Use it to become the team that you want to become, and here this is an opportunity to do so, and probably without breaking the bank to do so.
Yeah, and listen, let's say you bring in one or two defensive linemen in free agency. Let's say you bring in one or two via the draft. What does that do? That creates competition. Maybe that lights a fire under a guy like DeMarvin Leal, right? I mean, that guy. He's had injuries, but I would say I think it's fair to say that he's probably underachieved to his draft slot. Third round pick. I think the Steelers were definitely expecting much more out of him. Now, you could blame some of that on the Steelers. He is a guy who can play. He can basically play anywhere from 3 technique to outside linebacker, 9 technique in this defense. And, maybe you could sit down and say, okay, the Steelers really haven't given him a chance to excel at one position. Maybe that's true, but usually the talent rises to the top, and he hasn't really shown his talent on a consistent basis yet. But that competition brings out the best in everyone. It'll bring out the best in Keeanu Benton, because he's going to say, hey, this guy's trying to take snaps from me. I'm coming up on my rookie contract in another couple of years. I mean, I think that's good. And the Steelers, not that they've ignored defensive tackle, but they've kind of tried to address it third, second, fourth round. Yeah. I think they need higher end talent, both via free agency and a bona fide number 1 pick to come in here, challenge these guys, and really make it a tough rotation to crack.
No, I agree. It's something that I've thought about for years, as far as like a position that the Steelers were kind of forced into without that was outside of their control. Remember, they signed Stephon Tuitt to a major deal years ago when he was with the team, and it was supposed to be him and Cam Heyward that were those guys. And while that was going on, they were needing to address so many other positions: cornerback, the future at quarterback, wide receiver. They were trying to fix everything else that was aging out, including this offensive line. And then all of a sudden you lose a guy that was supposed to be a pillar for your defensive front and supposed to be the heck of a 1-2 punch with Cam Heyward and Stephon Tuitt, and then made it so that, imagine if Tuitt was around and then they drafted Benton, then Benton all of a sudden is a much lesser role. And instead of Larry Ogunjobi being the guy, you have a guy in Stephon Tuitt who was getting double-digit sack seasons next to Cam Heyward, and then your rotation's so much better. That's what the Steelers have to get back to, is like, look, you've had some time to kind of address these other issues. You've invested in the offensive line. That's why I think, you, me, Jerry, Brian, we've been talking about D-tackle is going to be an important part of this draft class or this offseason plan, and getting that right guy who can contribute in that way. That's why it could be a difference maker, because it creates more of a rotation. It creates competition. And truly, like you said, not only do you want to try to limit Cam Heyward's snaps this season to make sure that you can keep him longer, but you also want to put yourself in a situation that who your top 2 defensive tackles are once Cam Heyward retires. We don't know that right now. We got to see Keeanu Benton develop. And DeMarvin Leal, was a guy who was drafted who could play on the edge and play on the inside. He has to find a place this year, otherwise it's over. This is the last year of his rookie deal, and he hasn't really found a place where he's most suitable for the Steelers.
Yeah, and listen, there is a lot of top defensive tackles that are going to go in the first round in this year's draft. But look at Milton Williams, 2021 draft, 3rd round, Louisiana Tech. Like, who heard of Milton Williams, coming out of Louisiana Tech 4 years ago? You got to count on Andy Weidl and his scouting staff to find guys like that, maybe 3rd round, 4th round, 5th round, guys who can contribute, but maybe you don't have to spend a 1st round pick on it. Maybe you do. Maybe you double down 1st and 3rd, 1st and 4th, whatever it is. But you can't just count on building your football team with 1st round picks. There have to be gems in the middle rounds. And I think that's going to be something that Weidl and Khan are going to be judged on in the years to come. They've done a pretty good job here the first couple of years, but as we've seen, this roster is not complete, and they got a lot of work ahead of them.
You talk about one of those mid-round guys that could be one of those guys. Check out Aeneas Peebles out of Virginia Tech. He's a guy that I've been looking at on tape. I like his get up. I think he could be one of those pass rushers. He's a smaller defensive tackle at 6'1", but he's able to get after the quarterback. He could be one of those mid, third, fourth round guys that you draft after you've gotten that top guy, and then he becomes part of that rotation that you develop over the next few years. We'll keep an eye on the Steelers' situation at defensive tackle, but we got to talk about another coaching change. We now know who the Steelers' new linebacker coach will be. We'll talk about that next year on the North Shore Drive podcast and the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Chris Carter, Ray Fittipaldo. But first, I want to remind you this show is also brought to you by Savinas, Kane, and Gallucci. They're your mesothelioma and asbestos lawyers with over 85 years of experience. Call them today for a free consultation. That's Savinas, Kane, and Gallucci. We're also brought to you by Moon Township Honda, where you can visit your new Honda, get your new Honda vehicle at 5802 University Boulevard in Moon Township, PA, or visit their website, moonhonda.com. Here's a message from my friends at Moon Township Honda.
We gave the all-electric Prologue EX class-leading passenger space. And we made its tech intuitive with Google built-in. Perhaps that's why we were named Best Overall EV and Hybrid Brand by Kelley Blue Book. It's nice when a dream comes together. Buy online, reserve from select dealers, or visit your local Honda dealer today.
We're back here in the North Shore Drive podcast of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Chris Carter, Ray Fittipaldo. Ray, let's talk about the Steelers' new linebacker coach. They did sign a guy. Remember, Aaron Curry was the guy who departed. They signed Scott McCurley as their inside linebacker coach, a local guy from Newcastle, but he's been in the NFL for more than a decade, working primarily with Mike McCarthy's staff with the Packers and then the Cowboys. This is an interesting situation here because this is a guy who's experienced, but he's mostly been, that defensive quality coach or an assistant linebackers coach. Not the straight up guy who's had a bigger role in the NFL so far. What do you make of the decision to sign this guy to replace Aaron Curry?
Yeah, I think with Aaron Curry, this was his first position coach experience in the NFL, and McCurley does have more experience. I think he broke in with McCarthy in Green Bay. I think he was defensive quality control, but once he got hired by the Cowboys, his role grew there, and maybe that's what the Steelers need. There was a lot of communication issues last year in the middle of that defense to the back end of that defense, and hopefully McCurley and Gerald Alexander, the new secondary coach, can get on the same page, and they can make that work for the Steelers. I remember it was Super Bowl 45, and it was media day, and they had some of the players were on the field, but the assistant coaches were sitting in the stands. And I went up. They had a ton of Pittsburgh guys on Green Bay staff. My job that week was to cover Green Bay all week. So you had Darren Perry, former Steeler. You had Kevin Green, former Steeler. You had Ben McAdoo on that staff. I think Ben McAdoo was the quarterback's coach on that, or maybe he was the tight ends coach on that team before he became Rodgers' quarterback coach. And you had McCurley, who I think was just a young coach at that point. And, they were excited to talk to a guy from Pittsburgh. They were going to get their names in the Post-Gazette, and, they were just guys who were trying to work their way into the business now. And it's funny looking back 15 years later, McAdoo became a head coach, 6 years after that. McCurley now, with a big step in his career. So it's good to see these Pittsburgh guys, have a little bit of success. And I'm sure McCurley is excited about coming back home to play for his hometown team.
Certainly, that's a cool part of. Right, close, very close to that. But Ray, let's talk about the coaching staff, because as far as we've seen, the only guys who left were the secondary coach Grady Brown and the linebackers coach Aaron Curry. And you and I talked about it. Like, look, in the tail end of the season, one of the biggest problems on defense was the communication in coverage, especially, and that looks to the linebackers in the secondary as the primary culprits of that. So maybe that had something to do with it. But is this all the moves we're going to see this offseason, coaching wise, or are there other moves that you're expecting? Maybe some coaches that we don't know are about to be replaced, or will the Steelers actually sign another coach to their staff just to increase their staff?
I mean, Chris, if it's going to happen, if there's another move to be made, I guess it's going to happen this week, right? Because you are going to have the entire staff out in Indianapolis for the position drills, and they're not going to be out there for the entire week. But when the cornerbacks are working out, the Steelers defensive backs coach is going to be there, and when the linemen are working out, the Steelers line coaches are going to be there. So you would think they would have to have that situated certainly by next week. So I think if there's another shoe or two to drop here, I think it'll happen this week. I'm not really expecting anything, certainly not anything major. But I would think by the time we get to Indianapolis next week, watch these guys work out, we'll see who's there for the Steelers, and that I think will be the Steelers staff for the 2025 season. Rarely do you see these things go into March. You want to have your staff in place so they could scout these guys, look at them on tape, and give their feedback to Andy and to Omar and to Mike as well.
Yeah, I feel you on that. Like if there's moves, and here's the other thing. Like part of it is just the Steelers have been quiet. We didn't know about McCurley until this weekend. I bet that McCurley's had his walking papers as far as his orders as for a while now. Like and I assume the Steelers knew about certain guys that were moving on before we did, and so maybe there's some things that are going on behind the scenes that they just haven't announced yet, and that's just how they're keeping things close to the vest. And look, the Steelers do that a lot, but certainly like the time for needing to do that it's kind of past right now, right? Like the Steelers, we talked about, they need to, if they're going to make adjustments, they need to make them and get them set so that they could get to that play. And like you said, the combine's next week. You and I are going to be in Indianapolis next week, talking to players and prospects. And while we're learning about these guys from the sense as far as like who the Steelers might be targeting and learning more about how the field and using that to inform our big boards that we create for the Post-Gazette, the Steelers are learning who these guys are because they need to know who they're actually evaluating here, because how many times can you learn about who a player is, versus just what they do in a 40-yard dash or in on field drills versus talking to them in person, learning what kind of attitude they are, learning who, are they a leader? Are they a self-motivator? Are they a guy that you need to kind of get on a little bit more to get more out of? Those types of things are very important to constructing a roster, finding those draft picks, and building your team of the future.
Yeah, if you look at the offseason, the best ways for position coaches to get to know these players, you go to the Senior Bowl, you get one-on-ones with them there as well. You go to the Combine, you get one-on-ones. They might be, 5-10 minute short meetings, but you're really trying to figure out as much as you can about these guys in these meetings. And then, if Mike and Omar bring you along to a pro day, if you're at the pro day workout, that's probably your last chance really to get to know them. On their own, in their own setting. You could bring them in for a visit, of course, late March, early April into the facility. That's the last step, but it's a really important time of the year. There's going to be the best college prospects in the world. The top NFL prospects are going to be in one place. The Steelers are going to get to not only watch them on the field, but probably the biggest part of this is the evaluation process. Get to know them. Are they smart? How do they do on the whiteboard? What's their personality like? Do they fit into your team? Those are all things that kind of fly under the radar. Everyone's going to be focused on, okay, this guy ran a 4.4. This guy benched 225 36 times. But really, the nitty-gritty stuff, you want to get to know these guys personally, and the Combine is certainly a great place to get to know these guys.
Certainly is. We'll keep an eye on the players that are heading into the Combine and who the Steelers are looking at. And of course, the Post-Gazette will be there in full force, covering the Combine, getting a look at a lot of those players. He's Ray Fittipaldo. I'm Chris Carter. Thanks again for tuning into the Monday edition of the North Shore Drive podcast. As always, you can find the show on your favorite podcasting apps and on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoyed. Subscribe to this channel to get all those Monday, Wednesday, Friday episodes of the North Shore Drive podcast, as well as the daily content that comes out from all of our sports writers here at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Back Wednesday with more here on the Steelers right here on the North Shore Drive podcast. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. If you watch this video on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. For all the sports coverage from the Post-Gazette that we have to offer, visit post-gazette.com.